Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romance for a restful night. If these stories help you unwind, be sure to subscribe. For now, close your eyes and let's begin tonight's story. One Dance to Remember. The Marlowe's letter came up with the second post, and Clara Whitcombe read it twice standing in the hall. A fortnight's party at Blackthorn House, the usual people, and among the guests. Written in Mrs. Marlowe's looping, careless hand, as though it signified nothing at all, Lord Julian Ashford. She folded it, said something pleasant to the footman, and went upstairs. The stairs at Whitcombe Hall complained in 3 places, and Clara took them without hearing it, as one does not hear one's own breathing. Above her the east wing roof had been mended rather than replaced, so that on wet nights she could tell precisely where the mending stopped. 3 drops into the copper pail, a pause, 3 more. In September the beeches along the drive still made their cathedral. Nobody troubled to prune the roses on the south wall any longer, and so they climbed wherever they liked, which Clara privately thought an improvement. She was 24. Her aunts had begun to speak of her future in the tone one uses for weather that has turned. In her bedroom, the small one at the back, ivory paper with green leaves, curtains faded blue in uneven bars where 20 summers had come through the glass. She opened the narrow drawer of the writing desk. Her journals lay there tied in ribbon. The earliest had a warped spine. She had not read it in years. She had also never thrown it away, and she was honest enough to know that the 2 facts were not unrelated. November, 1816. The hand was rounder than her present one, the ink pressed too hard. She'd been 12. Her mother had been dead 11 months. Her gown had been made over from a gown of her mother's, and she had loved it until the moment she entered the assembly room at Marchmont and understood, with the terrible instantaneous arithmetic of girlhood, that the sleeves were 3 years wrong. She had been too tall. She had laughed at the wrong moment, joining a conversation she had not been invited into, and 2 older girls had exchanged a look and turned very slightly away. Nobody had been cruel. That was the whole of it. The humiliation had been small, ordinary, entirely survivable, and it had felt like being dropped into cold water. She had retreated to the wall and worked very hard at appearing to prefer it there. A young man of 20 had crossed the room. He did not look at the others, the child had written. He asked as if he had meant to ask all along. He had not mentioned the girls, nor told her she would grow up handsome. He had asked her opinion of the musicians and disagreed with it, and defended his disagreement seriously, as though her judgment were worth overturning. For the length of 2 dances, Clara Whitcombe had not been ridiculous. She sat now with the book open on her knees and thought that she had been a child, and had built a religion out of a kindness that cost him nothing. And yet, because there was a further thing she had never confessed to anyone. Every man who had since come into her view, the curates, the cousins, the young men with hunters and opinions, some quiet clerk at the back of her mind had measured against a memory and marked wanting. She had believed this was discernment. She was beginning to suspect it was a very well-appointed hiding place. She retied the ribbon. Downstairs her father was reading aloud to nobody about the propagation of ferns. "Papa, we're to go to Blackthorn." "Are we?" Sir Edmund looked up, pleased and vague. "You will want a new gown." "I shall want no such thing," said Clara, and kissed the top of his head. Blackthorn House, seat of the Marlowes, stood 4 miles east across the stream, and had been built to be admired from a distance. Pale limestone, symmetrical windows, an entrance hall that returned one's footsteps with interest. Where Whitcombe was warm and slightly crooked, Blackthorn gleamed. Mirrors doubled the candles and doubled them again, so that the drawing-room on the first evening appeared to hold twice as many people as it did. Clara saw him before he saw her. He stood near the fire with a glass he was not drinking, listening to Mr. Marlowe with an attention so flawless it amounted to insult. He was still handsome, better looking than the boy in her memory. The softness gone out of the jaw, grey beginning at one temple, the whole man planed down to something economical. But the warmth had not survived. What remained was courtesy of a very high polish, and Clara, who had spent her life reading faces, understood at once that it was a wall with excellent masonry. She had prepared, over 4 days of packing and sleeplessness, for a great many things. She had not prepared for the small, absurd shock of him being real. A man who would need his breakfast, who had mud on his boots, who had come into a room she was also standing in. Mrs. Marlowe performed the introductions with the pleasure of a woman placing furniture. Lord Ashford, Miss Whitcombe from the hall, he bowed. Miss Whitcombe. We have met before, said Clara. She watched him search. She watched the search fail. It was over in perhaps 2 seconds, and it went through her with a thoroughness that startled her, that the hinge of her whole interior life had not left so much as a scratch on his. You danced with me, she said, at the Marchmont Assembly when I was 12. Nobody else had. Then she saw it arrive. Something moved behind his face and was locked away at once, and what struck her was that it was nearer to alarm than to pleasure. He remembered and wished, visibly, instantly, that he did not. Ah, he said, then I fear you have been preserving a very inaccurate impression of me. I had begun to suspect as much, he laughed. It escaped before he could arrange it, and 2 people turned to look, because Lord Ashford was not known for laughing. The party had 13 days left in it, and the days were built to throw people together. Clara discovered within a week that she could not decide whether he sought her out or merely failed to avoid her. He was the cleverest man she had ever met, and he used his cleverness the way a wounded animal uses a wall, to keep anything from getting behind him. He was very funny about marriage. He observed at the table, apropos of a neighbouring engagement, that all attachments were finally a negotiated exchange in which both parties consented to be flattered. That is a fine sentence, said Clara pleasantly, but it isn't an argument. The table went quiet in the way tables do. Isn't it? You have described the Fanshaws and called it marriage. If I said all conversation was people waiting to speak, I should be describing one dinner where I sat next to Mr. Fanshawe, not speech. Something sharpened in his eyes. You object to the generalisation, or to the institution being generalised about? I object to a clever man being lazy at my elbow. You're much too quick to enjoy being that stupid. Mr. Marlowe choked into his wine. Lord Ashford looked at her a moment longer than was comfortable. Miss Whitcombe, you're quite right, and I shall never forgive you. She noticed something else that week, and it stayed with her. His mockery was not evenly distributed. He was mild enough about vanity, greed, ambition. But when anybody in the room did something plainly generous, when Miss Prewitt forgave a servant a broken tureen, when the curate walked 3 miles in rain to sit with a dying man, his wit turned to acid. At the far end of the same dinner, 2 of the men were talking about him without troubling to lower their voices much. Something about a house in Somerset, and money going into it every quarter for 3 years, and well, we all know what a house in Somerset means. Clara heard it the way one hears a clock strike in another room. It meant nothing to her yet. She noticed only that Julian, 12 feet away, had heard it too, and had gone on smiling with the particular stillness of a man who has decided not to move. On the terrace 2 nights later, with the ballroom door shut and the cold coming up off the stone, she said, "You like being despised. Nobody wears a coat they have already thrown out." The music came muffled through the glass. "The premise is unsound," he said. "Contempt is not a form of relief. It is generally supposed to be, by people who have not tried it." And then, after a moment in a different voice altogether, "No one enjoys being despised as much as others imagine." It was said without irony, and it was the first true thing he had given her. Clara did not answer. She had a strong instinct that if she moved, he would take it back. The doors opened, light and noise spilled out, and they became Miss Whitcombe and Lord Ashford again in the space of a breath. On the 9th night, there was dancing in the Blackthorn ballroom, 20 couples, the musicians in the gallery, hundreds of candles doubling themselves in the mirrors until the room seemed to go on for a mile. Clara danced twice, then found herself at the edge of the floor between one set and the next, momentarily alone, her fan half open, entirely composed. She understood the symmetry the instant it occurred, and thought, with a kind of desperate amusement, that she would not have her life rhyme. Across the room, he saw her. She watched him understand it too. She watched him hesitate, genuinely hesitate the first crack in the smooth front of him, and cross the floor. Miss Whitcombe. His voice was dry as paper. Would you care to correct an old memory? And Clara, who had rehearsed nothing, heard herself say, I think I would rather make a new one. She put her hand in his. Two things happened at once, and she was aware of both with unbearable clarity. His glove and her glove touched exactly as they had when she was 12, his other hand settling correctly at her back, his head inclining half an inch in a way her body recognised before her mind did. And nothing else was the same at all. At 12, that hand had meant safety. At 4 and 20 it meant heat, and the distance between them, and the fact that he was breathing. In the mirrors she saw them, and saw them again, and again. 4 couples, 6, a dozen, each slightly altered by the angle of the glass, and she could not have said which of them was the man society saw, or the one she remembered, or the one he believed himself to be. He said very low near her ear, You're not going to tell me I have not changed. No, you have changed enormously. I want to know what into. And Julian Ashford, who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being unreachable, missed a step. The party broke up at the end of September. Lord Ashford did not go back to London. He took Ashford Lodge, 11 miles off across the chalk for the winter, and gave out that he preferred the shooting, which deceived nobody at all and was not intended to. The storm came in the 3rd week of October and took the roofs off 3 cottages on the Whitcombe land. Clara was out at 7 with a list. By 8 she'd discovered that Lord Ashford had been at the Perrys since first light, coatless, arguing with a timber merchant from Alton on the subject of price. She did not ask him to come. He simply kept coming, 4 days of it. Mud to the knee, wet wool, sawdust, the smoke of green wood. On the 2nd morning she was on the ladder passing slate up to him, and her hands were so cold she dropped a piece. And he came down and took both her hands in his bare ones and held them shut inside them without saying anything, looking off across the field at nothing, until the feeling came back. Neither of them mentioned it. She thought about it for a week. On the 3rd afternoon, young Danby, who was 19 and useless and very willing, mismeasured a beam for the 2nd time, and Julian said something to him, quietly, 6 words, precise as a scalpel, that turned the boy's ears scarlet and sent him off to the cart to stand with his back to everybody. He was exhausted, Clara thought, and had been at it since dawn, and the boy had now wasted 11 shillings of somebody's timber. The excuse arranged itself in less than a minute, smooth as a drawer closing, and she went on with her work and did not think of it again. On the 4th day she came round the gable and found him counting coins into Mrs. Dowd's hand and saying something short and impatient that made the woman laugh and stop protesting. He had not seen Clara. When he turned and did see her, his whole face shut like a door. She said nothing about it. Not that day, not the next. Why? He demanded finally. They were walking the beechwood on the Whitcombe side of the stream, the leaves down, the grey trunks going up like the columns of a ruined nave. Why have you not once thrown my own generosity at me? Any other woman would have made me a small speech by now. It is practically an obligation of the form. Because you'd have spoiled it by supper." He stopped walking. "You can be called a blackguard at every table in the county and sleep like a stone," Clara said. "Say thank you to you, and you'll break something before the candles are lit. I have watched you do it twice. That is a monstrous imputation to lay on a man. It's also true, or you'd have laughed." They walked another half-mile in silence, and somewhere in the third quarter of it she realised she was not uneasy. She was comfortable. Being comfortable in silence beside him frightened her more than the dancing had. Attraction was a thing one could manage. One knew its symptoms and could take precautions. Companionship was another matter. Once, in her mother's leaking conservatory, with the rain shutting out the world and the smell of geranium and warm glass, he came in from riding and stood too near the orange tubs and said something perfectly ordinary about Jasmine, and Clara could not attend to a word of it, because she was watching a drop of water travel down his jaw. Nothing happened. She went up afterwards and sat on her bed, appalled at herself. For 12 years she had loved something clean and high, and safely disembodied, and this was appetite, ordinary as hunger, and it had walked into her mother's greenhouse in wet boots. He discovered she still kept journals and would not let it go. Am I in them? In the earliest, yes. What did you write? Clara considered lying. That you were kind. He looked away into the fire and did not speak for a long time, and she understood, coldly, that she had not flattered him. She had accused him. She learned other things that autumn. He rode out one Thursday a month and would not say where. He kept his dead father's last letter and could not burn it. He had not once gone into the churchyard, though when she went inside to her mother's grave he waited at the gate, and afterwards walked her the whole way home without offering a single word of comfort, and she found, walking, that she did not want any. He feels too much, she decided, and has built a machine to prevent it. She wrote something like it in the current journal and was pleased with herself. The thunder came in November, and she found him in the Whitcombe library at midnight with a glass and no candle but the fire. The room contracted at night. The shelves went into shadow, and only the hearth held. Character, he said, is the account society settles on after it has decided whether to approve of a man. It has no existence prior to the verdict. Then a good man in a locked room is nothing. A good man in a locked room is unverifiable, which for all practical purposes is the same condition. It's the opposite condition. The room is the only place it happens at all. She set down her book. You have an idea of love as well, I suppose. An idea of it. Love is a misapprehension sustained by mutual effort, and the entire art of the thing consists in not looking too closely. Everyone draws the person first, said Clara. In pencil, badly. I did. But at some point you have to hand them the rubber and let them draw themselves, or it isn't love, it's a portrait you painted and hung. And if what they draw is worse, then you decide whether you can live in the house with it. The fire moved. Rain came against the windows in one long gust. They were not discussing philosophy any more, and they both knew it. He set down the glass and crossed to her. No flirtation in it. None of the ironic swordplay she'd grown used to. He lifted one loose strand of hair from beside her cheek and put it back, and his thumb went along her jaw, and Clara didn't move at all. His eyes went to her mouth. She closed the distance, not all of it. She left an inch, deliberately, because she would not be the invention this time. She would be asked for. Julian took his hand away. You have mistaken me for someone else. No, said Clara, and left him standing there. Lady Eleanor Vale came into the county in December, widowed 9 months, in half-mourning that suited her extremely well. She was beautiful in the manner of a very good portrait, beautiful in a way that had been composed, and she recognised Clara across a drawing-room the way one recognises weather coming. She did not insult her. She was better than that. "You are fond of him," Eleanor said kindly over tea. And then, before Clara could answer, "I do hope you know about Mrs. Bell. She's frightened of me," Clara thought, "and is doing the cheapest available thing about it." That was the conclusion she came to, and she was wrong, and it would be 3 months before she learned so. The shape of it came out over the following week in fragments, none of them from Julian. There had been a woman, a house in Somerset, money moving quietly for years. Eleanor had discovered it and asked him to explain, and he had refused, had let the engagement break and let his father die believing the worst, and let London make a story of him, when a single sentence would have ended it. That was what she could not bear. She went to him in the Whitcombe orchard, where the apples lay bruising in the wet grass and the smell of them was sweet going toward rot. "Tell me it isn't true." "Which part?" said Julian. "Any of it. Tell me you did not stand in a room with the woman you meant to marry and let her think—" "I did." "Why?" "I can't tell you. Can't or won't. I fail to see that the distinction is material. It's the whole of it." Her voice was not steady and she let it not be. "I never thought you unfaithful. Not for an hour. I'm not asking for proof, Julian. I'm asking for one fact I can hold in my hand. And you would rather stand in an orchard and be misread than put a single thing into it. You complain the whole county has written you down a villain. You hand them the pen." The words went into him. She saw them go in. "There is a child," he said. "My brother's son. Henry died at 30 owing money to half of England, and I promised him at the last that the boy would be kept, and every door in this country shuts on a bastard, and if I say one word of it in a drawing room he will spend his whole life being that story." He looked at her with something close to hatred. "So, now you have it, and it is a weapon, and I have handed it to you. Is that what you wanted?" He turned and walked away through the wet grass before she could tell him that it was. It was not entirely an accident that put the journal in his hands. Clara had carried the childhood volume down to the Whitcombe library in a spirit of surgery, meaning to read it as a stranger would. She had left it on the arm of the chair when her father called her, and she had known going out that Julian was expected within the hour. Afterwards she was never able to decide how much of that had been forgetting. He read 4 pages. It was enough. He is the best man I ever saw. He would never hurt anybody on purpose. When she came in, he was standing with the book shut in his hand and his face like something scoured. 12 years, he said. You made me a saint at 12, and you have carried him about ever since like a relic in a box. Do you know what that is? You have never once looked at me. You look through me, at him, and when I fall short you make the arithmetic come right again in your head and call it understanding. At the Perrys I was contemptible to a 19-year-old boy who had done nothing to me, and I watched you find a reason for it in under a minute. You did not even have to work at it. That is not knowing a man, Clara. That is housekeeping." Clara opened her mouth and found nothing in it, because he was right. "Yes," she said, "I did that." It stopped him. "I have been doing it since I was 12, and I did not catch myself at it in October. So you may have that. It is true, and it is worse than you know." She put her hand on the back of the chair. "But you're not jealous of another man. You're jealous of yourself. You cannot forgive me for keeping the proof that you were once good. Because if you were good then, and it got you nothing but this, then either goodness is worth nothing, which is a restful thing to decide, or you gave away something real, and you've been spending the rest of it ever since to spite the people who didn't notice." He put the journal down on the table with terrible gentleness and went out. He punished her 4 days later at the Marlowes' 12th night party with the precision of a man who had planned it and hated himself throughout. He was not vulgar. It was worse than vulgarity. For an hour and a half he made himself entirely charming to Lady Eleanor Vale, in full view, in the way that a man's attention is a public document, the head bent, the private laugh, the hand at her elbow going into the supper room. Clara stood by the pillar and understood exactly what was being done, and why. He wanted her contempt, because contempt was safe, because a woman who despised him could not surprise him. None of that understanding made the smallest difference to the pain, which was simple and enormous and located under the ribs. She called for the carriage at 11. At Whitcombe she took the childhood journal out of the drawer and sat with it a long while by the bedroom fire. Then she opened it, found the first page on which his name occurred, and tore it out. She tore out all of them. It took some time. There were more than she had remembered. She was crying before she finished, and she let herself because she knew exactly what she was doing. She was not giving up Julian Ashford. She was giving up the most faithful companion of her adolescence, the boy who had never once been unkind, never petty, never flirted with a beautiful widow to make a point, who had waited 12 years in a drawer, perfect, patient and unreal. The pages went into the grate and lit at their edges and curled and were gone in under a minute, which seemed to her the cruelest thing about paper. "You're no longer obliged," she told him, "to become the man I imagined." 10 days later she went to her aunt in Bath. At Ashford Lodge, 11 miles off, Julian learned of it on the morning she left and made no attempt to stop her. He rode instead to Blackthorn, where the ballroom stood shuttered, the chandeliers in their holland bags, the floor dull without candles. He stood a long time in the precise place where she had waited at the edge of the floor. He had spent 3 years explaining to himself that everybody eventually leaves. He was 32 years old before it occurred to him, standing there, that he had personally arranged every single departure. It was there that the Whitcombe groom found him at 4 in the afternoon, having been sent 4 miles with a folded paper and no note at all. Sir Edmund had turned it up beneath the cover of a book in his own library, where it had slipped when the rest was torn away. He was a great deal less vague than anyone supposed. He had read it, and thought for some while, and then rung for the groom. It was 4 lines in a child's hand about a country assembly in 1816, and it ended. "When I am grown, I should like to be the sort of person who notices people standing by the wall." Julian Ashford sat down on the edge of the musician's step and put his head in his hands. Clara went to the pump room because her aunt insisted, and drank the water, and danced with a Mr. Bexley who was 34 and amiable and possessed of 1100 a year, and who would, everyone agreed, do very nicely. It was Mr. Bexley, in fact, who taught her the last thing she needed to know. He was kind. He was even rather good. And dancing with him she discovered that she did not miss a gentleman, or an ideal, or a memory. She missed a specific and irritating man. His dry pause before a joke, the way he looked at the floor when anybody was tender to him, his loathsome habit of answering a question with a question, the quality of his silence in a beechwood. She missed faults she had no intention of excusing. Oh, she thought, standing in the middle of the set with a hand raised. So that is what it is. It was never real until now. 6 weeks earlier, in Somerset, on the last Thursday in January, Julian Ashford had sat in a small parlour and asked a question he had been avoiding for 3 years. The house was clean and rather bare. Margaret Bell poured his tea and waited because she had learned that he arrived at things sideways. "I am going to arrange matters differently," he said at last. "There is a way it may be done through the bank with a trust in the boy's name that would not require—" He stopped. "It would not require any of this to be hidden, not entirely. Some of it would come out. And you have come to ask my permission." "Yes." Margaret set down the pot. "In 3 years, my lord, you have never once asked me what I wanted." "No. Why not?" He looked at the fire for a while. "Because if I had asked you, you might have said something I could not do, and then I should have had to decide and to argue, and you would have had a share in it. His voice was perfectly level. It was the last thing left that was mine, deciding for you. I could not stop them thinking what they thought, and I could not make my father live, but I could go on paying, and I could go on saying nothing, and nobody could take that from me. If I had asked you, it would have become an arrangement between two people. Instead, it was... He stopped again. A monument, said Margaret Bell. Yes. You are generous, she said, and I shall be grateful to my grave, and Thomas will be told so when he's old enough to be told anything. But I never asked you to be ruined. That part you chose, and I have watched you spend 3 years living in it like a house. She picked up the pot again. Ask me what I want, my lord. He asked her. It took until the middle of February to arrange, and when it was done it was open enough that any determined man might discover most of it, and Julian found he minded that far less than he had expected to. Then he went to Bath. He came on the last day of February, in rain that had been falling since Bristol, into the little sitting room of a narrow house on a crescent where Clara had been reading the same page for a quarter of an hour. There was road mud on boots he had not thought to have cleaned, and rain still in his hair. She set down her book and did not stand. She had never in her life seen him disordered. I am not going to apologize gracefully, he said. I should not believe you if you did. So he told her instead. All of it, in the wrong order, badly. Henry, charming and reckless and dead at 30. The promise. Margaret Bell and the boy Thomas, who was 10 and had Henry's ears. Eleanor, who had asked him to explain and whom he had regarded as failing a test she never knew she was sitting. His father, who had believed the county over his son and had died in April 3 years ago with the thing unmended between them, and Somerset in January, and what Margaret had said to him about the house he'd been living in. The fire burned low, neither of them attended to it. He'd begun across the room. At some point he was at the hearth. At some point after that he was near enough that she could see the rain in his hair. I was wrong in the orchard, Clara said. I told you your silence cost you nothing but pride. It cost a boy his name. I said it anyway, because it was a better sentence. It was a true sentence. It was half of one. Then have the other half, Julian said, which is the ugly one, and which I would rather not say. He looked at the grate. I was proud of it. Not at first, but afterwards, when they had all made up their minds. There was a comfort in it I have never admitted to any living creature. If everybody was going to believe me wicked, it became easier to oblige them. It excuses a great deal. A man who has been wronged need never inquire whether he is behaving well. Clara was quiet a while. Keeping that child was the best thing you have ever done, she said. It cost you everything you had, and I honour you for it. 12th night was not a sacrifice. 12th night was a man breaking a plate to see who came running. She watched him take it, and half expected the shutter to come down, the wit, the wall. Yes, he said. Then, I don't want you to believe in me. Good, said Clara. He looked for a moment almost stricken. She stood and closed the distance herself. I want to know you. That's a different offer, and it's worse, and you may find you can't stand it. He said, Clara, which was the first time, and asked in actual words like a man with nothing left to defend whether he might touch her. She answered by kissing him. Months of arrangement came apart at once. His coat went somewhere. She never afterwards knew where. He had her against the panelling and her name kept coming out of him between kisses as though he were checking she was still there. And then, because it was Julian, he mastered himself and became careful. Slow hands, deliberate gentleness, a perfect performance of consideration. Clara understood what it was. It was the wall, rebuilt in a softer material. She took his hand and put it where she wanted it. Not submission. Permission. Are you certain? Stop asking whether I remember you, she said. I am here, with you. Something in him gave way. Afterwards she could never reconstruct the order of it, only fragments that stayed whole. Firelight and the rain going on against the windows, and the strange freedom of a house belonging to neither of their histories, the heat of his mouth at her throat, and how he came back always to her mouth, because looking at her turned out to be the most intimate act available to him. Her own hands at his shirt, finding along the ribs a long ridged scar from some riding accident he had never mentioned. His attempt at a joke about it, her refusal to let him finish the joke. She learned that he understood appetite perfectly well, and was almost undone by tenderness, that when she was gentle with him he stopped breathing. And what stayed longest was not any single pleasure, but the fact that neither of them held command for long. He guided, then let himself be guided, then guided again, power handed over and handed back until the handing was the thing itself. Nothing was taken, everything was entrusted. At the end he lost his composure entirely, and Clara, who had wondered for months what lay beneath all that irony, found she was holding a man who was shaking. She held him a long time. Nobody had done that for him in 3 years, and she thought it likely nobody had done it before then either. Much later, with the fire gone to embers, she said, "What were you like at 12? He began to laugh. Then, without any warning at all, he cried. Quietly, briefly, his face turned into her shoulder, and mourned, at last, the young man he used to be, without demanding that he come back. They returned to Hampshire in March. Sir Edmund asked his daughter 2 questions in the Whitcombe library with the door shut. "Do you know what people say of him?" "Yes." "Do you believe it?" Clara said. "Some of it." Julian, waiting in the hall, heard through the door his prospective father-in-law's bark of laughter, and did not understand for some weeks that this answer had won him more than any defence could have done. He understood rather sooner that the old man had sent him a folded paper by a groom in January and had never once mentioned it, and that this was a kind of verdict too. Lady Eleanor Vale made one last appearance. She offered, over tea with real feeling, to put the thing right. She would say publicly that she had misjudged him, and restore his character with a sentence as she had once destroyed it. 3 years earlier he would have crawled for it. "You are very good," Julian said, "and I decline." He would let the plain fact of his fidelity stand where anyone who cared to look might find it. He would not put a 10-year-old boy into the mouths of London for the sake of his own name. Eleanor turned to Clara at the door. "You believe I told you about Somerset to injure you?" "I did believe that." "I told you," said Eleanor, "because I wished to see whether he would explain himself to you." She drew on her glove. "He never would to me. I am glad to have been wrong about him, and I do not intend to say so twice." Clara didn't rescue him from any of it. She stood beside him while he chose. He proposed in April in the orchard, which was doing its annual imitation of a snowstorm. No ballroom, no ancestral hall, no orchestration whatever. Only long wet grass and last year's apples going into the earth and blossoms coming down on both of them. "I ought to warn you," he said, "that I cannot promise to become the man you remember." "I should be terribly disappointed if you did," said Clara. He had prepared something on the ride over. She watched him arrive at it, and watched him decide against it, and watched him left with nothing in hand. He looked at the grass. He said her name, and then asked her, and got the order of the words slightly wrong, and did not attempt to repair it. She said yes. After the wedding she found, in the locked drawer of his study at Ashford Lodge, with permission, which he gave stiffly and which cost him something, that he had kept exactly one object out of their whole history. It was not the journal. He had never wanted the journal. It was a dance card from Blackthorn dated the 9th of November, 1828. Beside his name, in her own hand, written so absently she had no memory of doing it. A new memory. 3 winters later they went to a country assembly at Marchmont, because a tenant's daughter was coming out and it would have been unkind not to. Clara saw the girl before he did. Perhaps 13, too tall, in a gown that had been fashionable some years earlier, standing against the wall and working very hard at appearing to prefer it there. 2 other girls had looked at her sleeves and looked away. Then she saw her husband see her. He hesitated. Clara noticed the hesitation. He was thinking of what it would look like, and of what he was owed, and of the dozen small cynicisms he still carried about him like coins in a pocket. She caught his eye and smiled, and said nothing at all. Julian crossed the room. He bowed to the girl with complete gravity, as though she were a duchess and he a man requesting a favour, and asked whether she would do him the honour. Clara watched from the far side of the room, and what she saw was a difficult, clever, still occasionally cruel man of 35, who had been unkind to her in January over something stupid, and had apologised badly in February, who could not be thanked without leaving the room, who was still, at his age, learning tenderness the way a grown man learns a language, late and with an accent. She saw him choose it anyway. He glanced up across the dancers and found her, as he always did, and Clara Ashford understood, at last, the difference between the 2 great loves of her life. The first had been for a gentleman she remembered, who had never existed, and who had never once failed her. The second was for a man she knew,